Chris Wilson never imagined that a quiet evening at home would lead him to murder. His mother, Laura, had always been the center of his world, until one secret affair with a police officer unraveled everything. Now, with his mother dead at his feet and a lie spinning out of control, Chris finds himself trapped between a shattered family and a secret he can never escape. The Wilson family appeared to be the epitome of the perfect suburban life. Mark, the father, was a successful businessman known for his reliability and calm demeanor. Laura, his wife, was the charming and warm-hearted homemaker who always made sure their home was pristine and welcoming. Together, they raised their only son, Chris, a quiet and intelligent teenager who was just starting to make his mark in high school. They lived in a modest but well-kept house on a tree-lined street in a peaceful neighborhood, where everyone knew each other, and life seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. To outsiders, the Wilsons were the kind of family people admired, the kind they aspired to be. Despite the outward appearances, something had been shifting in the household. It started slowly at first, like a faint crack in a once sturdy foundation. Chris noticed his parents had been arguing more often, though the arguments were always hushed and behind closed doors. It was subtle enough not to raise alarm, but distinct, enough for him to feel the tension growing. Mark was often away on business, leaving Laura to manage the household, while Chris spent more time in his room, focusing on his studies and avoiding the mounting friction between his parents. Laura, too, seemed distracted, and Chris began to sense that she wasn't quite the same. She wasn't as affectionate as she once had been, often lost in thought, and at times, distant. The family's seemingly perfect image began to crack as Chris observed Laura's increasing secrecy. It wasn't just in the way she withdrew from their conversations, but in her subtle changes, always on the phone, always rushing out for appointments, often late coming home. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but at the time he couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Chris's suspicions deepened when he began noticing his mother's unusual behavior. It wasn't the small things like coming home late or being distracted during dinner. Those could be explained away. It was the more peculiar details that began to nag at him. He noticed she was more frequently talking on the phone, often whispering in hushed tones, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. When he asked her about it, she would brush it off, claiming it was just a friend or a business call. But Chris, who was no fool, could tell when someone was hiding something. One evening, he saw her slip into the driveway, her car parked in the shadow of the garage, as if she didn't want to be seen. She was wearing a tight-fitting jacket, makeup, applied more than usual, and a nervous energy about her that he couldn't ignore. It was almost as though she was trying to make herself look a certain way, like she was going somewhere or meeting someone she didn't want him to know about. That's when the name Officer Harris started to surface. Chris didn't think much of it at first, just a casual mention during one of her phone calls, but it was always the same name. Officer Harris this, Officer Harris that. He asked her who he was, and she quickly changed the subject. Chris started paying more attention, and over the next few days pieced together a disturbing picture. He noticed her texting often late at night and, on one occasion, catching her in the living room, hurriedly erasing something from her phone. The unease settled deeper in Chris's stomach as he started to realize that this was no ordinary relationship. It was a secret, one his mother clearly didn't want him to uncover, and yet, it was right there in front of him, hidden in plain sight. The tension in the house grew unbearable for Chris as the truth he had been dreading began to take shape. One afternoon, while his father was at work and his mother was in the kitchen, Chris found himself standing by her dresser, his curiosity consuming him. He had spent days feeling a gnawing suspicion in his gut, and today, something urged him to look further. As he rifled through her things, trying to be as quiet as possible, he stumbled across an envelope tucked away in the back of a drawer. His fingers trembled as he pulled it out, noticing the small gold police badge printed on the outside. With a sense of dread creeping over him, he opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter with a familiar name, Officer Harris. His heart pounded as he read the letter, a personal note that seemed too intimate for something so formal. His mind raced. Why would his mother have such a letter? It was clear. that it wasn't just a coincidence or a professional relationship. The words felt charged with an undertone of secrecy, and Chris couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered something far darker than he had imagined. His thoughts swirled in confusion and anger. This wasn't just an innocent friendship, as his mother had led him to believe. This was something else entirely, something hidden, something that betrayed everything he thought he knew about his family. Chris couldn't believe it. His mother, the woman he had always trusted, the woman who had raised him with love and care, was involved in a secret affair with a police officer. The shock and betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. His entire world seemed to collapse in on itself. Chris couldn't help but wonder how long this affair had been going on, and more importantly, how deeply his mother had been hiding this from him and his father. His mind, overwhelmed by the revelation, was consumed with one question. Why? Why had she kept this from him, from their family? The discovery of the letter was only the beginning. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing his grip on reality. As the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and the family dynamic started to shift in ways Chris couldn't ignore. His father, Mark, who had always been a steady, dependable presence in their home, seemed more distant than ever. He was consumed by work, leaving early in the mornings and coming home late at night, his tired eyes betraying the stress that had begun to mount in their marriage. Mark's mood swings were more frequent, his frustration growing as the cracks in his relationship with Laura deepened. Chris too began to notice the way his mother acted around his father. The once warm conversations at the dinner table had become strained, filled with awkward pauses and unspoken tension. Laura, who had once been the heart of the family, now seemed like a stranger, distant, aloof, and consumed by a secret that was tearing their family apart. At times, Chris could see a flicker of guilt in her eyes when she looked at Mark, but she quickly turned away, as if trying to suppress the truth that lay between them. Meanwhile, Chris's obsession with the affair grew. He found himself studying every move his mother made, watching her interactions with his father, scrutinizing her every word. He even began to follow her, trying to piece together her schedule, to see where she was going and whom she was meeting. His nights were spent lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of Officer Harris and what that relationship meant for their family. Chris knew his mother was hiding something, but the more he dug, the deeper the feeling of betrayal sank into his soul. His anger began to fester, growing uncontrollably with each passing day. What started as confusion and hurt was slowly transforming into something darker, something he didn't know how to control. The more Chris reflected on the affair, the more his anger consumed him. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted him. It was the sense of powerlessness. How could his mother, the person he trusted more than anyone, have kept such a secret from him, and worse, from his father? Each thought twisted deeper into resentment. He watched as his father, Mark, grew more despondent, unaware of the affair that was slowly destroying his family. Mark would come home, exhausted from long days at work, only to be met with a cold, distant wife who offered nothing but superficial pleasantries. The father he once admired was now a shadow of the man he used to be, but Chris couldn't bring himself to reveal the truth. What could he say? How could he break the heart of the person who had always been there for him? But it wasn't just the emotional toll that weighed on Chris. It was the constant feeling of being betrayed by both of his parents. His mother had built a life based on secrecy, and his father, who would never suspect such a thing, was left oblivious to the storm, brewing just under the surface. Chris's mind began to spiral. He couldn't stop imagining what his family would look like if everything came crashing down. His father would be destroyed, and his whole world would fall apart. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't let it go. His anger festered, turning into a need for control, for resolution. The idea of confronting his mother filled him with both dread and exhilaration. But even as he plotted how to do it, a far darker thought began to take root in his mind. What if there was a way to make it all go away? What if he could stop the affair before it tore his family apart forever? What if there was a way to eliminate the problem once and for all? The more he considered it, the more the thought gnawed at him. Could he go through with it? Was there a point of no return? The night of the confrontation arrived like a storm on the horizon. Chris had spent the day wrestling with the dark thoughts that had taken root in his mind. The anger had festered for weeks, building up like a pressure cooker waiting to explode. He had watched his mother leave the house again, dressed in that same manner, carefully put together, wearing more makeup than usual, always seeming to be on edge. This time, he didn't wait for her to come back. He had already made up his mind. As soon as the front door clicked shut behind Mark, signaling that his father had retired for the night, Chris's resolve hardened. His mother, Laura, had returned a little earlier, and he could hear her moving around the kitchen. His pulse quickened, his mind racing as he stood in the hallway trying to steady his breath. He walked into the living room, his every step feeling heavier, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. When he entered the kitchen, he saw her there, pouring herself a glass of water, unaware of the storm brewing in her own son. He stood still for a moment watching her, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. His voice was shaky, but the words came out in a rush, fueled by weeks of frustration and betrayal. "Why? Didn't you tell me, Mom? Why did you lie?" Laura froze, the glass of water hovering in her hand. She set it down slowly, her eyes flicking to him, a flicker of panic crossing her face. Her calm exterior cracked for just a moment and Chris saw it, the guilt, the shame that she had kept buried for so long. She tried to explain, but Chris wasn't listening. His mind was consumed with images of Officer Harris, of the lies, of the secret that had torn apart everything he thought he knew about his mother. The argument escalated quickly. Chris's emotions spilled over, his hurt turning to something darker. He couldn't control it anymore. Words turned into raised voices, and the confrontation became a blur of accusations. In a fit of rage, with a strength he hadn't known he had, Chris shoved his mother. She stumbled backward, and the collision was enough to send her crashing into the kitchen counter. The knife, a sharp gleaming thing that had been left out from dinner preparations, was within reach. Before he knew it, his hand was gripping the handle. The anger, the betrayal, the overwhelming flood of emotions all coalesced into a single, deadly impulse. With a single motion, Chris acted. It was over before he could fully comprehend what he had just done. The room was eerily silent as Chris stood over his mother's motionless body, the weight of what he had just done crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His heart raced in his chest, the frantic pulse of adrenaline still pumping through his veins. Time seemed to stretch and bend, as though everything around him had frozen. The knife, still in his hand, gleamed under the dim kitchen light. His mind was a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of horror. How had it come to this? What had driven him to such an irreversible point? Laura lay on the floor, her once warm and loving face now cold and lifeless. Chris's breath came in shallow gasps, his hands trembling as he let go of the knife. The truth of his actions settled in like an insidious poison, spreading through him with a sickening finality. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything to fix this. But the horror of the situation left him paralyzed. He stumbled backward, his vision blurry as the reality of what he had done took shape. For a moment he could hear nothing but the ringing in his ears, drowning out the frantic thoughts that tried to make sense of what had just transpired. The anger that had consumed him moments ago now felt hollow and absurd. How could he have let himself cross that line? But the fear soon overtook the guilt. The noise of his own breathing sounded deafening. Panic surged through him as the weight of the consequences hit. His mother was dead. There was no turning back now. The police would find out. His father would be crushed, destroyed. His whole life was about to unravel, and he would be the one responsible for it. In a daze, he looked around the kitchen, his mind searching for a way out. His hands were slick with sweat, and his stomach churned. He knew he had to act quickly. There was no time to waste. Chris's mind raced, frantically plotting how to cover his tracks, to make sure no one would know the truth of what had happened here. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. No one could erase the horror of what he had just done. Panic gripped Chris as he stood in the kitchen, his mind scrambling to figure out what to do next. His mother's lifeless body lay in front of him, a stark reminder of the irreversible moment he had just created. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out all logical thought. The horror of his actions was beginning to settle in, but there was no time to process it. He had to act quickly. His first instinct was to run, but that would never work. He knew that the police would be at the door soon, and they would be able to piece together the truth. He couldn't risk that. He had to cover his tracks. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his shaking hands. His mind raced as he looked around the kitchen, searching for something, anything, that could help him stage the scene. He moved quickly, his movements mechanical. First, he wiped the knife clean, ensuring there were no fingerprints left behind. Then, with trembling hands, he repositioned his mother's body, trying to make it look like a struggle had taken place. He moved her closer to the counter, shifting her arms and legs as though she had fought back. His stomach churned with every motion, but he kept going. The next step was the mess. He knocked over a few items, scattering them across the floor to create the illusion of a robbery gone wrong. A broken lamp, some knocked-over chairs, anything to make it look like someone had forced their way into the house. Chris didn't know what else to do. It felt like he was slipping into some kind of nightmare, a place where nothing was real anymore, and he was powerless to escape it. When he was satisfied with the scene, Chris's next move was to wake his father. His heart pounded as he walked down the hallway to Mark's room. He had to make this look convincing. He had to make his father believe that a stranger had done this, that his mother had been the victim of a violent crime. But as he opened the door to his father's room, he knew that the truth was already slipping through his fingers. He couldn't undo what had happened. His world was already falling apart. Chris stood frozen at the threshold of his father's bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared into the dark, quiet room. Mark was fast asleep, oblivious to the nightmare that had just unfolded, just a few feet away. Chris could feel the weight of the lie he was about to tell pressing down on him, suffocating him with its heaviness. He knew he had to act quickly, but every fiber of his being was screaming at him to stop. He wanted to wake his father, to somehow stop everything before it got any worse, but he couldn't. The path he had chosen was already set, and there was no turning back. He stepped inside, his movements slow and calculated. His father's steady breathing filled the silence, and Chris's mind raced with thoughts of what he was about to do. He had never felt more alone in his life. His father, the man who had trusted him, who had given him everything, would never see him the same again. And Chris knew it. The moment the truth came out, everything would change. Forever. With shaking hands, he gently shook his father's shoulder, whispering his name. Mark stirred, his eyes blinking open in confusion. It only took a few seconds for Mark to process the fear in Chris's voice, the panic that was now taking over his son. "Dad, something happened. You need to wake up. It's Mom." Mark's eyes shot open, instantly alert. Without thinking, he followed Chris, his instincts as a father kicking in. They hurried down the hallway and Chris led him into the kitchen. When Mark saw Laura, lying motionless on the floor, his face drained of color, his legs buckling under him as he collapsed to the ground in disbelief, he began to shout, to call for help. But Chris stood silently, watching it all unfold with a sickening sense of detachment. It was working. His plan was falling into place. Mark was distraught, overwhelmed by grief, and Chris was there to play the role of the confused, heartbroken son. As Mark frantically dialed 911, Chris allowed himself one last fleeting moment of peace, a cruel, quiet satisfaction that the chaos he had unleashed was now in motion. He couldn't help but wonder, though, how long it would take before everything spiraled out of control. The 911 call was frantic and full of emotion, but in the back of Chris's mind, the weight of his actions settled in. The paramedics arrived quickly, followed by the police. Chris remained in the background, playing his part, trying to keep the panic in his chest from rising to the surface. He watched as the professionals moved in, taking charge of the situation. His father was still in shock, his hands shaking as he tried to explain what had happened, but Chris could barely focus on the words. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the horror of watching his mother being carted away, covered with a sheet. The police questioned his father, taking down every detail they could, but Chris couldn't bring himself to speak. He knew that any word, any misstep could expose him, and he had to play this carefully. It wasn't just the fear of getting caught. It was the overwhelming realization that the lie was now a part of him, and he couldn't escape it. As the scene unfolded, Chris couldn't help but wonder how long it would take before the truth began to surface. He had watched enough crime shows to know that things didn't stay hidden forever. He was terrified that some detail he hadn't anticipated, would unravel his carefully constructed facade. But for now, the police had no reason to suspect him. He was just a son grieving the loss of his mother. In the days that followed, the investigation moved forward. Chris found himself in a strange limbo, trapped between the reality of what he had done and the world outside that continued to turn as if nothing had changed. He had a front-row seat to his father's sorrow, to the funeral arrangements, to the well-meaning condolences from family and friends. All the while, Chris was haunted by the knowledge that it was his fault. Every time he looked at his father, he saw nothing but a broken man, oblivious to the son who had shattered their world. But the worst part was the secret gnawing at him. The unbearable weight of the lie that would one day catch up with him. The question of when, not if, would keep him awake at night, wondering how much longer he could keep the truth buried.